All right, the past. University of Michigan Law Quad provides a nice backdrop for a discussion of the past. Gothic architecture, covered with vines, very beautiful. I love vines. It totally destroys buildings, but it's beautiful. All right, the past. There's been a lot of forms of governments tried in our nation's history. In our world's history, sorry. And a lot of those are seen as dead, as experiments that failed. We look down heavily on monarchies, theocracies, socialism, as all being backward and somehow illegitimate forms of authority. The earliest governments were probably dictatorships. Actually, Marx thought that governments could only form once a society was able to create a surplus. That is, as long as a group is just sustaining itself, is just meeting its requirements for survival, no one can take power. No one can claim authority over the rest. But as soon as you have a surplus, as soon as there are luxuries available, that's what allows someone to claim authority. I don't know a whole lot about this stuff, and I'm not a historian, so this is just a vague coverage of some of these forms of government. But certainly early on, there were people who claimed authority through God's word. And they would tell people how to live based on this divine knowledge. Now, over time, this gave way, well, and none of this is linear. See, that's another thing. Here in the West, we like to think of all of history as just an upward progression. Things just getting better and better. When the truth is, when we look at history, there are a lot of steps back. There are a lot of things that pop up time and again. I mean, certainly we like to think of our democracy as something that America invented, right? When the truth is, we're not really a democracy. We're a republic. And certainly Rome was the first great republic that we know of. And even that wasn't representative, because the people who got a say were landowners, which was just a small fraction of the populace. I mean, most people lived on somebody else's lands and worked them for them, and they had kind of extended families, communities based on these farms, the farmlands. Anyways, now with monarchy, you have a step away from the divine. They still claimed a divine right to their rulership, but their authority was just based on property ownership. And the king would claim ownership, essentially, of all the lands, and so anyone living on those lands would have to live based on his rule, his laws, his enforcement. Over time, I keep saying that. Sorry this is so shitty. Okay, just to jump away from monarchies. Socialism versus communism. Communism was an amazing ideal. The idea that all members of a society had equal ownership, equal stake in that society's property and riches, and that the leaders whose job it was to rule had no greater claim to property or riches than any other member of society. Communism's never really been realized, though. What we have instead is socialism. And this is probably due to power corrupting. As soon as you have people in charge of setting laws and rules, then they start making things better for themselves. And the poor people end up waiting in bread lines for days. Anyways, we have this concept of things getting better and better, and democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms of governments that we know of. As if our quest is just to minimize the evil that is inflicted upon us by those in power. And so we've progressed to the point where we choose who leads. Anyways, these are some of my basic thoughts. We look at socialism today, like in China, for example, as backwards, as basically a dictatorship. And we think of democracy as the best option. And certainly us Americans like to think that our form of government is the best thing on the planet right now. And I would submit to you that our problems are quite apparent, and more people are understanding them as time progresses. So let's move on to the present in a separate video at a separate location. Hope you enjoyed this past backdrop. Let me go find a modern building to use as a backdrop for the present. See you soon.